Welcome to Theology for the People. My name is Nick Cady, and the purpose of this podcast is to bring you theological concepts and discussions in a way that are accessible and understandable. My guest on this episode is Pastor Matt Smethurst. He's the author of a new book called Tim Keller on the Christian Life, which is part of Crossway Publishing's series looking at different theologians and what they have to say regarding the Christian life. In this episode, Matt talks to us about the process of revisiting Timothy Keller's writings and sermons. He's looked at and listened to so many of them, and he's considered and boiled down the legacy of Tim Keller's contributions to the church and to theological discussion. As part of our discussion in this episode, Matt and I talk about some of the criticisms that have come against Timothy Keller in recent years, both from those within his tribe and from those without. And Matt gives some really good insight about that, and he talks to us about Tim Keller, the evangelist. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. I'll be back at the end with some closing thoughts. Well, Matt, thanks for being a guest on Theology for the People.
Yeah, Nick, nice to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Tell me and our listeners a little bit about yourself, what's been your journey in ministry and brought you up to this point where you're at right now.
I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, godly parents, became a Christian, I think, at a young age, and really grew in my faith, though, a lot at James Madison University. Learned to dive into the Bible in a deeper way, developed a love for theology, learned how to share my faith, and ended up going overseas and serving as a missionary for a couple years in East Asia. And yeah, that I would say then over the last 15 years since then has kind of been a journey toward understanding what God's word teaches about the church, about ecclesiology, and how the church is central in his design for the world. It's through the church that his wisdom is made known to the powers and principalities, Ephesians 3:10. And so in falling in love with the church, I developed a desire to ultimately serve as a pastor. I was a lay pastor, an elder for 6 years at a church in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was a seminary student. But in 2022, our family and some other adults from that church in Louisville moved to Richmond, Virginia to plant River City Baptist Church. And so we just surpassed 3 years. God has been super kind to us. I have really good help, and we're just trying to be a bold and faithful gospel witness here in a place that really needs it.
Oh, that's great.
Hey, hold on a second. I'm sorry
Yeah.
that this is a church planning thing, by the way, Nick, that where I office out of a co-working space
Yeah.
that we share with others. I think people are talking in the hallway.
Okay. It's not terrible.
Is
and
it
my
not?
filters will get rid of it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Don't worry about it too much.
And let me just add one more thing. But most importantly, I'm married to Megan, and I have 5 children, 2 of whom are about to turn 1. They're identical twin boys. And so life is good, but it's also very full.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. So, wow, church plant, little kids. Yeah, good season of life, it sounds like. I look back fondly at those seasons in my life, and so I hope you're enjoying it. You recently wrote a book. Kind of tell us a little bit about it. So it's about Tim Keller, but it's really about Tim Keller on the Christian life. And what does that mean? I mean, explain that, please.
Yeah. Do you have a copy of the book, a hard copy?
Not yet. I ordered one, and it
Okay.
hasn't come in yet.
Well, I wish I could just send this through the screen to you, but we just got copies the other day, and Crossway did such an amazing job, I think, just with the design, the cover, the dust jacket. It was a real honor to partner with them. Yeah, so Tim Keller on the Christian life, that's really what the book is. It's focusing on Tim's best teaching on everyday Christian living. So he left behind a voluminous body of work, over 30 books, nearly 50 years of sermons, not to mention interviews, conference messages, courses, studies. And that's a ton of material to wade through, and it's intimidating for the average Christian who may have heard of Tim Keller. Maybe they respect Tim Keller. Perhaps they've read something of his along the way, but they may also not really know where to begin in terms of diving deeper into his body of work. And so I've tried to produce something akin to a greatest hits album. I didn't really think of it that way, but one of the endorsers of the book described it as that. And I think that's probably fair. And there are so many endnotes in the back for people who want to dive deeper that you could think of those, I guess, as kind of the hidden tracks. I don't expect most readers to read all the endnotes, but I was wanting to show A, I've done my homework, and B, it's kind of a nod to the way Tim Keller wrote books. In fact, recently Trevin Wax wrote an article called Tim Keller, King of the Endnotes, and he shares his top 10 favorite endnotes that Keller ever wrote, because they weren't just bibliographical information, they were substantive, and often there were little Easter eggs hidden in there. So I've tried to do the same thing. But yes, I'm wanting to synthesize and distill Tim's best teaching on bread and butter, everyday, timeless Christian living. So this is not a book about public theology. It's not a book about cultural apologetics. It's not a biography. It's not a critical evaluation of his legacy. All of those things are worthy projects. But I'm really trying to do something a bit more simple and focused. And that's just bring out what I think is the best of his material that will really stand the test of time.
Yeah, that's great. And just, like you just said, you're not writing a critical analysis of his life and ministry. But I do think it's important to get out in front of this at first. It seems like, I don't know if you go back maybe 10, 15 years. I mean, Tim Keller was like the favorite child of all evangelicals, right? He's almost like a uniting figure that like everybody could come around and say, yeah, what this guy is teaching, what he's doing, it's just so good. But it seemed like in recent years, and I think it was really sad that it happened right around the time when he was sick and dying, that suddenly there became a lot of pushback against him, people critical of his teachings and feeling that he accommodated too much, that he didn't talk about some issues enough. What would you say to somebody who immediately dismisses, for example, a book like this by saying, oh, well, Tim Keller, he's this or that?
Yesterday, someone reached out to me and said that they were 2 or 3 chapters in, and they said it was renewing their appreciation for him.
Mm.
And my purpose in this book is not to do PR for Tim Keller or anything like that. But that was gratifying to hear, because I do think that there are some folks who either have dismissed him outright based on perhaps things they've heard and they've never engaged firsthand with his material, or they did so once upon a time. They kind of have already had their Tim Keller phase, and they feel like they gleaned what there is to glean from Keller, and they've moved on to bigger and better things. And I'll just say that for this book project, I revisited all of the books that I had read, 4, 6, 8, 10 plus years ago. And I was repeatedly struck by how fresh everything still felt, and not just fresh, but biblically robust and faithful. Now, I will say that I understand, Tim was not interested in being a kind of partisan political figure. And so I can understand certain critiques of people who may think that he was too silent on certain major social issues of our day, abortion, for example,
Yeah.
especially in a place like New York City. But though, and I would sympathize with that critique to a degree. I wish Keller had spoken out on that issue, for example, more than he did. But the reason he didn't, and this is where I think slander can take root, the reason he didn't was not because he was a coward, and it was not because he was trying to curry favor with cultural elites. The reason he didn't, it's actually something he explicitly articulated in sermons, and even Kathy wrote about this in an article, is he thought he was an evangelist. And he one time said that, if Jesus rose from the dead, then we need to care about what he said. But if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then why care about anything he said? So if you have secular Manhattanites who are not interested in the teachings of Jesus because of what the Bible teaches about, say, sexual ethics, Keller's thought was not that, well, what the Bible teaches about sexual ethics is embarrassing and I need to avoid it and apologize for it. Rather, his thinking was, this person needs to first and foremost stumble over the stumbling stone himself. And that's actually what he meant by contextualization. Contextualization was not a way of sidestepping the severity of sin or making Christianity cool. Contextualization was a way of making Christianity clear. And to the degree Keller would say that you've done it well, the offense of the gospel has become even more evident to the person. And so if someone were to come up to Tim and say, well, I can't trust the Bible because of what it teaches about this moral or social or political issue, he and his classic apologist, evangelist way of doing things would say something like, okay, so just so I'm understanding, you're saying that because of what Christians believe and teach about X issue, Jesus couldn't have gotten up from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the difference, and one of the differences I have with Tim is when it comes to ecclesiology and ministry philosophy, but and therefore I think in terms of what a Sunday morning service is, in terms of who you're primarily trying to engage, who you're primarily speaking to, Keller was operating more as an evangelist. And I think that is why he wanted to keep the tip of the spear, the claims of Christ and the gospel of Jesus. But yes, I mean, when you produce that much material, literally thousands of sermons over the course of 4 decades, you're not going to get everything right at all times. And I do think that there is a place for appreciative critique of Tim Keller. He was not perfect, but he lived and ministered to point people to the one who is, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think people impoverish themselves and impoverish their churches when they just dismiss Keller as some kind of squishy sellout, when in reality, the more you listen to his preaching, the more you realized, oh, actually, this was a guy with guts. This was a guy who moved to New York City in 1989 before it was hip and cool to move to a place like New York. It was a dangerous place. Crime rates were as high as they had been in 100 years. People thought the Kellers were crazy to go there. And so I think there is some revisionist history going on, especially the more you listen to his sermons and you realize, wow, he was denouncing sin and confronting Manhattanites in their idolatry in a really forthright way. So that's a longer answer maybe than you were looking for, but
No.
I'm not here to defend everything Keller ever said, but I also think people are foolish and impoverish themselves to dismiss his work.
Well, it's a great answer, and I think it's a really important question when it comes to this book. And I think it's like actually really honoring to him, to like answer those kind of questions that people are, if they're going to dismiss the book, I mean, I wouldn't want them to do that. Like you said, they're going to miss out on so much. Yeah. I also, another thought I had, I used to, really enjoy a lot of his stuff. Like you said, everybody had their kind of Tim Keller season in the past. I remember mine, I was living in Hungary at the time, and I read his book, The Prodigal God, and I was just like, what, it was so clear and so helpful. And I really, I got a lot out of it. But I did notice something. It's not just true of him. And I think it kind of gets back to what you were just mentioning, is that it's important to remember that as you listen to Tim's sermons, maybe more than his books, you have to understand that he's pastoring a church. And like you said, his ecclesiology might be somewhat different than yours, but he's pastoring a church. And I think that sometimes that can be easy for people to forget, right? He's not presenting, when you listen to his Sunday morning sermon, he's not presenting something that's necessarily for everybody everywhere. He's speaking to the people who are sitting in front of him. And of course, some of that stuff is going to be broadly applicable, but some of it's going to be, dealing with the issues and the Holy Spirit speaking to the people right in front of him. And, this was like Martin Lloyd-Jones's whole thing, right? It's like he didn't even want his sermons to be recorded. Someone did, but he didn't want to be recorded because he felt that there was something happening in that moment that was special. So I think that's important to keep in mind. What do you think was the most challenging part for you in writing this book?
Oh man. I didn't just want to regurgitate Tim's books.
Mm.
As helpful as they are, I thought that would be a less interesting kind of project. And I didn't want it to feel to the reader just like a highlight reel of Keller quotes where you have essentially one block quote after another. And the reader thinks, well, man, I could have just read a Keller book rather than this. What I wanted to do is go deep into his sermons because I think that's where so much of the gold is, much of which never made it into his books.
Mm.
And so I was sorry. Can you just give me 1 second?
Sure.
My throat was feeling, I could feel a cough coming off.
Yeah, no worries.
What was I saying? Deep into his sermons, because I think I said like that's where so much of the gold is.
Yeah.
That never made it into his books. And so that's why I was wanting to scour, really, kind of like a treasure hunter, Keller's published material, both written and spoken, to find the very best stuff. The kind of stuff, honestly, because I wrote this book as a pastor. You mentioned that Keller was a pastor. And by the way, that's so important to emphasize, because you cannot understand the Tim Keller everyone thinks about without understanding the Tim Keller no one thinks about. You can't understand New York Keller apart from understanding Hopewell, Virginia Keller. Hopewell, Virginia is a really small, almost rural town, only about 30 minutes outside of where I live in Richmond, Virginia. And that's where he spent his first basically decade as a pastor in his 20s and early 30s. That's where he preached his first 1,500 expository messages. And there were only 2 people in his entire congregation who had graduated from college, and both of them were elementary school teachers. It was a church filled with just simple, salt of the earth people. And Keller loved them well. He pastored them well. He once said that in a small town, your pastoring sets up your preaching, meaning if people don't trust you as their pastor, they don't care what you have to say to them as a preacher. But in a big city like New York, it's often the opposite. Your preaching sets up your pastoring. If people don't respect you as a preacher, then they're probably not going to come to you as a pastor. So it's just different contexts. And I think understanding that Tim was a pastor, but also I'm a pastor. So what I was trying to do in this book is bring forth the kind of stuff from Tim's teaching that I would want my own church members to hear, to read, to wrestle with, and ultimately to live by, because it's, I think, the tip of the spear when it comes to Tim's teaching was a dynamic encounter with gospel grace. He didn't just want to engage in information transfer. He wanted to bring people into an encounter with Jesus Christ himself and all his sweetness and goodness and beauty.
Did you have access to his messages from Hopewell?
I did, yes.
Was there a difference in them that you noticed between the ones in New York and?
Well, I've listened to far more of his messages from Redeemer than I did from West Hopewell Prez. But the ones I heard, it's funny, Nick, there's a sermon from 1977 titled Two Adams that I listened to, which is just a brilliant, Romans chapter 5, Christ is the true and better Adam, although he wasn't using the term true and better yet. But it was just a glorious presentation of how Christ doesn't merely bring us back to what was lost in Eden, but he gives us something even better in the ultimately, and will, in the new heavens and the new earth. Christ has succeeded where Adam failed, where Israel failed, where you and I failed. It's all the kind of ingredients of the stuff we would come to know and love from Keller in later years. But what struck me is that he's not quoting in that sermon the New York Times, but he does quote the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which was the local paper at the time. So even then, you could tell he was a student of his context. And though he was speaking to a not very educated congregation, he was challenging them to think and to engage with their neighbors in a way that actually makes sense, to climb into their neighbors' worldviews and kind of poke them in the idols from within.
Wow, that's fascinating. What do you think it was about Tim's life? I mean, was there something about his own life that informs the lessons that he taught about the Christian life?
I think Tim also cannot be understood apart from realizing that he was a modern day Puritan. If you've read Puritan paperbacks, and I would really commend that to your listeners, Tim was a man of deep piety, deep spirituality. He had a vigorous prayer life, even though it was also a struggle. He wrote a great book in 2014 on the topic of prayer. He gave a talk one time at Redeemer, kind of an open forum type thing about his own personal journey in prayer, kind of 3 different stages and what his prayer life looked like. But even near the end of his life, he was saying, like within months of his death, he was telling a reporter, yeah, the one thing I wish I had done differently is I wish I had prayed more.
Really?
And so Bethan, you referenced Martin Lloyd-Jones earlier. His wife, Bethan, one time said, you cannot understand my husband apart from understanding that he was first of all an evangelist and then a man of prayer. And in many ways, Tim is the same. He was a prayerful evangelist. And that explains so much of the, not just the genius of what he produced, but also the focus of what he did. So I would say, yeah, you have to realize that Tim had an intimate relationship with Jesus Christ and wanted more than anything else to invite others in to that communion.
Hmm. So I would imagine you got into writing this book because you had an appreciation for Tim Keller to begin with. But how has that grown? Like your appreciation for him, how has it grown through the process of diving in deep and, reading his stuff again, listening to his messages?
Well, again, I don't think Tim Keller hung the moon. It's not like I engaged in this project in under the illusion that he was perfectly balanced in every way and never made mistakes or always did things the way I would. But I will say that oftentimes when you're getting to know a person, a public figure, or you're studying them, the closer you get, the more disillusioned you become.
Mm.
I did not have that experience. Now, granted, I didn't have a close personal relationship with Tim. We knew one another, and he was kind enough to endorse my book on evangelism, Before You Share Your Faith, and we would correspond over email from time to time. But he did that with tons of people, and he was a lot closer, obviously, to many other colleagues in ministry than me.
Mm.
So I really mainly got to know Tim through his writing and through, I consider myself a careful student of his teaching. And the deeper I explored it, the more I came to realize this man is not trying to reinvent the wheel, and he's not trying to say new things. He's trying to say old things in a new way. He has a unique gift. Colin Hansen points this out in his book on Tim, a unique gift of being able to synthesize multiple voices. I mean, some of it, Nick, isn't even a spiritual gift. Some of it is just natural gift. Tim had an incredible memory. He could remember most everything he had read and even kind of where it was on the page. And so he was an incredibly just productive person and had this amazing ability to survey a landscape, not just culturally, but even within evangelicalism or even with it over the pages of the Bible, and to connect the diverse dots into a coherent whole. And that never ceases to amaze me, but that's also not the kind of thing you can easily try to reproduce. It's like telling someone, you don't tell someone to model their ministry after Charles Spurgeon. And so there are some things I think in Keller that can't be reproduced by an ordinary pastor, but the most important things can be, because the most important things about Tim weren't his recall or his ability to turn a phrase. The most important things about Tim were the fact that he had been so gripped by the gospel. You mentioned the prodigal God earlier. He said that was the most distilled essence of his teaching, the idea that Jesus, that there's one way to be saved, but there are actually two ways to be lost, two ways to be alienated from the Father, and that sin is so subtle and insidious that you can have two people sitting side by side on the same pew, hearing the same sermons, singing the same songs, involved in the same programs, and yet they're there for completely different reasons. One is there to please God as a response to his grace. The other is there to earn God's favor or to stay in God's grace. And so you can have a true Christian and a moralist headed for hell, even though on the outside they look exactly the same. And I just think Tim was brilliant in being able to climb into our hearts and kind of just turn the lights on through the help of the Holy Spirit, of course, so that we could see the idols. In other words, the substitute saviors, the God replacements that had been lurking there all along.
Yeah, I remember some of his teachings on those topics, and they were just so incredibly helpful and insightful. And I mean, still things that I think about to this day, the idea that, yeah, like you said, the whole point of there in Luke 15 is like, yeah, here's a bunch of stories about people who are lost. And then he kind of like Jesus surprises you. And just the fact that Tim articulated it so clearly, that helps you understand that it's not just, drug addicts living in a dumpster shooting, heroin into their eyeballs who need to be saved, but it's the guy next door who takes his kids to school on time every day, right? Who doesn't know the Lord. That guy needs to be saved too. So incredibly helpful. Now, in your opinion, what do you think is like, if you could distill it down, is there one thing that you would say is the most important lesson or teaching from his life and his ministry that your book conveys?
That Jesus Christ is not just a proposition to be believed, but is a person to be known, enjoyed, and treasured. So Tim didn't use the phrase Christian hedonism, which John Piper has popularized, but given their similar influences, if you think about it, Jonathan Edwards, C.S. Lewis, have massively shaped both John Piper and Tim Keller, even though their temperaments, the ethos of their respective ministries are very different. There's also more similarity than it may seem in the way that they talk about this dynamic encounter with gospel grace. Tim would often invoke Jonathan Edwards' simple illustration that it's one thing to know a lot about honey and all of its properties, but it's another thing to have tasted it. And we were made to taste and see that the Lord is good. And I think that's the through line that connects everything Tim read. If you go to any of his books on all these major topics, right? Prayer, suffering, his last published book, forgiveness, all the way back, to justice and idolatry and all these books he produced. He is summoning us, yes, in different ways and from different angles and with different language, but he's summoning us to the throne room of grace to revel in the fact that we are adopted children of the living God. He sometimes referenced illustration from the Puritan Thomas Goodwin, who said, imagine you see a man and his young son walking down the street, and all of a sudden you see the man pick up the son and twirl him around and hug him and kiss him and then put him back down, and they keep walking. Keller asks, channeling Goodwin, was the son any more legally his father's child when he was in his father's arms? No. But he experienced his sonship in a unique and precious way. And that was what Tim was after. He wasn't chasing an experience, but he wanted believers to be enamored with and overwhelmed by the radical, prodigal love of God for us in Christ.
That's really good. How do you envision people using this book as individuals, maybe in their personal lives? What about leaders in ministry? Who's it for, and how do you envision it being used?
I hope it's a on-ramp, not a cul-de-sac. So the point of this book is not to read it and think, got it. I, um, one of the illustrations Tim used is that we all have influences that have shaped us. And if you think of a person like a tree, if you cut a tree in the middle, you see certain rings. Well, who are the rings in your tree? That's who's influenced you. I certainly would not want someone to read this book and think, got the Keller ring in my tree, I'm going to move on. My hope, rather, is that it would whet people's appetite to explore and to dive even deeper into his body of material, that it would his body of work, that it would leave people wanting more, because there's just so many riches out there. I mean, last week I was listening to one of his sermons as I was getting ready to preach, and in 1994, just hearing the way that he was expositing the text, applying it to people's hearts with vivid illustration and heart-searching application, it was just so edifying. And my hope is that it will not create more Tim Keller fans, for the sake of being fans, but that it will lead to a renewed appreciation for the way God used him to communicate the gospel and how it applies to all of life in a clear and compelling way. And I just want to be clear, this book is not written for academics or for pastors. My hope is that pastors will recommend it and give it to ordinary church members to help them navigate daily life. And the most moving chapter that I worked on was the last one on suffering, not just because that's something that we all face in a fallen world, but also because of the way Tim himself suffered and ultimately died. And I think I say something to the effect of the most powerful message he ever preached was that of his own life and death. And you could just see that, yeah, he really meant everything he had taught. He wanted to go be with Jesus above all.
Yeah. Was there anything about this as you were, going back through messages and reading books? Was there anything that surprised you? Anything that you felt that maybe you overlooked the first time around when you interacted with his material?
Good question. One of the things that I think is an underrated emphasis in his ministry is friendship. So I actually have a whole chapter devoted to that topic. And we live in an incredibly lonely age. The U.S. Surgeon General has even declared loneliness a health epidemic. And Tim, of course, was ministering in America's most transient city, a place where people don't go to make deep friends or to invest in meaningful community and accountability, but a place where people go often to make a name for themselves and to climb the ladder. And so I think Tim, as a good pastor, was often sounding the note of the need for deep, rich, vibrant friendships. A lot of that was I think arising out of his own friendship with Kathy. You can't understand Keller apart from Hopewell, Virginia. Like I said earlier, you also can't understand Tim apart from Kathy. She was a dynamic, intellectual equal and deep friend. And I think her reward is in heaven. I think only in the age to come let me say that again. I think only in the age to come will we realize how much she stood behind, encouraged, supported, and ultimately enabled so much of who he was and what he was able to do. But also C.S. Lewis, and by the way, Kathy is the one who introduced Tim to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote Kathy when she was a young girl some letters, actually, in the early 1960s before he died. And Lewis has a chapter in the Four Loves on friendship, which shaped a lot of Tim's teaching on that theme. So I would say that was one that maybe when I first set out to write the book, I didn't know if that would require a whole chapter, but sure enough, it did. And that's actually the chapter where I also talk about the necessity of commitment to a church. I was also struck by how no nonsense, just kind of in your face Tim was about telling Manhattanites, you need to join a church. You talk about your love of community, but you hear the word commitment or accountability and you run the other way, and that's not okay. So yeah, that's one example, but there's probably in every chapter I could point out things that, a year and a half ago, I either was unaware of or certainly less aware of than I became the deeper I explored his work.
That's cool. Well, Matt, where can people kind of connect with you online? Is there a place where they can find other writings or keep up with your preaching or anything like that?
I'm a big TikToker. No, I'm just kidding. I don't even really know how TikTok works. Okay. I am, pastor of River City Baptist Church, so people can listen to our sermons there. I'm on Twitter and relatively recently just started an Instagram account. So,
Nice.
those are a few things. And I have a few other books on Bible reading before you open your Bible, evangelism before you share your faith, and the scintillating topic. Are you sitting down for this, Nick? The scintillating topic of deacons. So if your church leaders are thinking through that topic, I've written on that, which, by the way, was the first thing Keller ever wrote about. His
Exactly what I thought
his
of,
first published resource, 1985, out of his doctoral work, was called Resources for Deacons.
Yep. How did you enjoy writing about deacons? Did you take anything from Keller's book?
I did. And, it's not the topic that gets me out of bed in the morning. It wasn't my life's passion to write a book on deacons, but the folks at Crossway and 9 Marks who invited me to write it told me that it was the most searched for term on the 9 Marks website every year, and there wasn't a book on it. And so I realized, well, the book does need to be written, and they've asked me repeatedly to do it. So I did it. And I've actually been really encouraged by the response.
Excellent. All right. So people can check that out. We'll put some links in the show notes. And Matt, thanks for your time today. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, Nick, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Theology for the People. New episodes are released on Mondays this season, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast, and that way you'll be notified when new episodes come out. If you haven't done so yet, you can follow us on podcasts, on Spotify. You can follow us on YouTube, and also we're posting on TikTok now. So if you'd like to support this podcast, one of the best ways you can do that is to share this video or share this podcast episode with someone you think would benefit from it, and leave us a review on whatever app you listen to this on. Until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless you.